Time to start. So, hey, everybody, and thank you so much for attending today's investor webinar for ORCA. Really, really excited to be here and really excited to be today's host, welcoming Carolyn and Jade, who I'm going to throw over to make some introductions very shortly. But before I go into today's webinar and the structure, I first just wanted to make an acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the land in which we're meeting today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, paying my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So, as I mentioned, very excited to be today's host for the ORCA Investor Webinar, where effectively during today's structure, we're going to be going over a pitch deck, which will take roughly 15 to 20 minutes to really go into depth on the ORCA investment opportunity, the industry, the problems and the main opportunities that we see in front of us as a business right now. And then we're going to be using the rest of the time for a Q&A session. So what I'd really like everybody to do is to use the chat function. Great, the chat function is already getting filled. Jade and Carolyn, thank you very much for starting and kicking off the chat function. But please do feel free to add questions into that chat function as and when they come up in your mind. We will address them when we kick off the Q&A session. So I think now is a perfect time to throw over to yourself, Carolyn, to quickly introduce yourself before we get underway with that pitch deck.
Thanks, Robin. And I'm just going to apologize in advance that I'm having to add people at the same time as sharing my screen. So probably not ideal. So if I jump off, you'll understand I'm just adding someone into the chat. Welcome, Chris. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining. And thank you, Robin, for hosting, and for Jade, supporting our venture. Yeah, I guess, it's wonderful to be able to share this day from an ORCA perspective, to be able to release our ORCA investment and to be able to share, I guess, our journey from where we started 5 years ago to where we are now. My background is from a traditional farming family and have worked with institutional investors and large-scale investment acquisitions in agriculture. And I guess really passionate about enabling investment into and preserving of family farms. And I think it's taken a whole lot of contributions to be able to get to a point from an investment perspective where we can actually achieve that. And we're really keen to be able to talk through the ORCA project and go into some deeper dive details today.
Fantastic. Jade, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm Jade Miles. So I'm with Sustainable Table. We've been on the ground for about 13 years, but in the last couple of years, we've really actively changed direction towards finding a way to connect our regenerative farmers with our investment partners of all different spheres of investment, who are also values aligned in that regenerative approach, which is actually harder said than done, because for the most part, investment in Australia is fairly heavily dominated by an extractive paradigm, and that's really difficult to partner with our regenerative farming folk. So we've done quite a bit of research in the last couple of years, and I'll talk more about that after Carolyn presents her slide deck. But yeah, great to be here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, Carolyn, over to you to share the slide deck and tell us all about the ORCA investment opportunity.
Fantastic. Thank you, Robin. So ORCA itself is an organic producer cooperative. I'm just going to share my screen so that you can follow where I'm up to. But just to give you a really quick background of ORCA itself, we're founded in 2017. Really, as I said before, about enabling investment, specifically in farmland is where we started, in obviously my passion in organic agriculture and preserving family farms. But the ORCA project has basically identified, through a pilot project that was funded through the generosity of Sustainable Table, really a seed project to try and work out why organic grain was so inefficient across the organic supply chain. And through that project, we've put together some really key aspects where we believe it can be a revolutionary project, in the sense of not just changing the organic supply chain for grain, but actually across the whole organic sector. if I can just, so the investment itself is obviously from it has three key components to it, which I'll talk through today. But basically, the key areas of it are really to understand that the barriers for organic grain or organic product generally is basically being strangled by a lot of the large scale production centres that are really centralised and locking out a lot of producers. And what this means is, unless you're part of the commodity market, it's really hard to build out that supply chain. So we've basically, we're a producer cooperative. We're building a bulk brand. So what that means is we're not building a retail product. We're not building a mum and dad brand that's going to be in the supermarket. Sorry, this is where I'm going to have to jump out to admit someone into the meeting. Sorry, everyone. And basically, to be able to build a marketplace that is two-way. So one is it shows the producers in terms of what they're growing and how what the demand is for their product. Sorry. What their demand is for their product, what the price points are for their product, what the quality parameters are, and then fundamentally also around the traceability. One of the key things we've identified is just how fragile and how fragmented the organic and any single origin product is. And through much better blockchain technology, through QR coding, we can actually then follow grain and other products potentially from the farm to the processing to the end consumer through our bulk brand. The organic industry itself, the Australian Organic Market Report just came out 2 weeks ago, which is actually very timely for our project. It identified that there's now 55 million hectares of organic land in the country, which is more land than any other country in the entire world. But interestingly, our organic market is only a $2.6 billion market at the moment. The US, which has less land, their market at the moment is more than $60 billion. So that's an incredible upside comparative to our market, which we believe provides just such a huge upside for the industry to be able to grow, both in terms of the amount of product, but also in terms of the efficiency of the end product. So if we're producing grain and we're producing beef, we should be having a much more efficient outcome than what we're currently doing. There's actually a lot of organic product that is ending up in the conventional market, and that's because of this supply chain inefficiency. So the key product, the key areas of this project is around obviously the organic grain products that we've identified. We've got producers from the Riverina into Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia, all growing organic grain, different organic grain products, and really limited by what they can do and what obviously their end markets are. And that's what we're basically trying to identify through this project. Obviously we want to build in the traceability. The technology side of this project is really important. The organic grain or the organic grain industry generally is really hard to find organic producers. I always say to people, if you want to find an organic producer, then you might have to go and look under some rocks to try and find that. And our project basically seeks to change that, to make organic producers really present in the market and not seen as cottage growers either. We've got producers that are farming more than 5,000 to 10,000 hectares of land, so they're not cottage growers as sometimes the market would have them known as, and they're actually really leading their industries in terms of what some of their yields and some of the on-farm practices that they're demonstrating. They're growing, really sustainable. There's one grower, particularly one of our key members, and they're growing for a really good brewer, and they're doing a sustainable carbon neutral beer. And they've actually reduced the footprint of the farm by more than 50% through the biological farm practices on farm. So there's some really big outcomes that can be achieved, but obviously the transparency and the traceability is key to be able to verify that data. So the key focus of the project is around the physical infrastructure. So some of the key aspects are the actual grain processing side of things in terms of dehulling, colour sorting, very technologically advanced equipment. that actually deals with the fact that you're dealing with organic grains that may have weed seeds or may have other components in it, which in a traditional conventional system, you don't necessarily have that same need for higher technology because of the sprays and the chemicals that they use. They often have just very much monocrops where that infrastructure is not so needed. And it's also much larger scale. You know, we're dealing with a decentralized production system as well as a decentralized supply system. The marketplace we're looking at is basically has that buy-sell component, has a contractual aspect, so producers can list products and then sell it into a given market, even to the point where people can, our producers can plant products and be able to execute contracts for the forward supply of that product, you know, in 6 months' time. One of the things about the organic grain industry is that it's very, it's much more reactive to markets. If one processor goes offline, which has happened in the last 6 months, that has a really big downstream effect on the rest of the producers. And that's what we're trying to diversify, to be able to build our producers into other markets, so that if one market, if one market falters, then the other markets are not very far behind. The other part is building in the brand. Obviously, as I mentioned before, we're not looking at doing a retail brand at this stage. We're very much looking at a large consumer, a large bulk brand that actually helps underpin the supply of some really strong organic brands that are existing, that have major retailer shelf space already. And what they want is a really strong and reliable supply for the next 5 years. And so that's what we're basically building into, is that existing farmers' own bulk brand. So the investment is basically structured as a cooperative. We basically have a very unique structure in that retail investors can invest via our retail arm, which is through our investor shares, and wholesale investors are able to invest directly into the unit trust. This is all outlined in our term sheet, which we're happy to provide after this webinar. So I guess and I just wanted to comment on our incredible team. We certainly wouldn't be here at this time if it wasn't for our incredible team of our board members, of which Greg and Trevor are online today, our investment committee of Alan and Dom, also our legal and finance people, Box Forest and TNR. And a lot of, I really want to acknowledge our producers as well that have trusted us to be able to put this project together. One of the things about the organic industry is producers have often been singular and very alone in their regions. You know, because they're not farming the same as all of their producers, they often feel very alone in their areas. We had a grain producer event last week, and we had producers from nearly every state, you know, connecting on the phone. We had a producer that was in his tractor actually planting at the time, and being able to connect producers that all have a sense of loneliness. And I think that that's the thing about ORCA, is really trying to connect organic producers and people that are wanting to transition to biological growing systems and not feeling threatened by that. And I think that's a really strong part of what ORCA is trying to build. And then obviously build in behind that the investment to be able to address some of the key barriers that are quite different to a large-scale conventional growing system. From an ORCA perspective, as I said before, you know, we've got 280 members across the country. We have producers that are growing across all different markets. Obviously, this project specifically is around the grain sector, but we fully expect the same technology and the same transition to occur in the meat sector and the dairy sector. So obviously we're starting with the grain industry, really seeing that the grain sits in underneath the rest of the sectors, particularly around the livestock feed side of it. The investment funds that we're looking at utilising, I did want to do a big shout out. I'm not sure if I've even told Ellen this part yet, but I think we've just kicked over last night 50% of phase 1, which is amazing in terms of pledges, which is great. Our intention is to invest into the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure. Obviously, we have a much bigger pipeline of infrastructure required, But what we believe and what we understand is that the most important part of the, is that the project is actually the technology in terms of building the marketplace and getting the product to be able to move, and actually to increase the transparency and traceability of the products themselves. And that's really what the market is seeking. And that's obviously given the project that we've just been through with Sustainable Table. So the investment offer, as I said just before, we've just kicked over the 50% of phase 1. We're aiming to have the first phase funded by the end of June. And then obviously we can move directly into the second phase. The second phase is really the key part of the infrastructure side of it, much more focused on that. Whereas the first phase, as I said, is more around the technology component.
There we go. Perfect.
Can you see it now? Yeah. Yep.
Perfect. So you just said that you passed around about 50% of phase 1?
Yes, that's right. So 50% of this phase 1 here. Yeah. Which is very awesome. So that's obviously just from a pledge perspective, which we're rounding up all the pledges, which are closing on Friday. So we're asking everyone to give us an indication of their interest. And then obviously we'll go through the official documentation and people can be committed through, by the end of June.
Got it. Fantastic. Fantastic. So did you want to open up the Q&A at the moment, Carolyn? Was there anything else that you wanted to cover?
Sorry, I might just jump across to Jade. One of the reasons that I invited Jade to be part of this is I think the real interest here, or the real concern, is just the disconnect between what organic and regenerative producers and supply chains need versus what the investment side of the investment world is understanding. And Jade's just done this incredible whirlwind trip, and I'd love to invite Jade to be able to share a little bit about the investment landscape, and then we can come back to the Q&A, if that's okay.
Thanks, Carolyn. I do want to say, I want to congratulate our co-op on the work that you've been doing. It feels huge to you guys, I know, and for those of us who are goalposts, you guys are without doubt providing some of that absolute clarity that organisations like ours need to understand the landscape that we're working within. And there's not only the complexity of building the foundation of solidarity amongst the growers that you're bringing together, which is an absolute feat in its own right, given that you're working across landscapes and across geographies. But you're also giving us insights at a micro and macro level to understand exactly what each sector is comings around infrastructure needs, around culture development, around the role that government can play and the role that investors can play right across the investment spectrum. And so those insights and that information is so critical to truly understanding what it is we're actually working with, because for so long we've been trying to understand why it is that the regenerative ag sector has found it so difficult to find partners that understand and are values aligned. And even throughout this process, I understand that seemingly understand it, but actually when you put the nuts and bolts on the table, it's really difficult to explain exactly what it is that's needed in order to shift the system. And so, as Carolyn just said a moment ago, we have undertaken over the last 12 months a project that we affectionately refer to as the RIF, but it is the Regenerative Investment into Food and Farming Roadmap. It's not a map in that it says plan A, plan B, plan C, or step 1, 2 and 3. It's a wayfinding guide, really, that tells us what we're doing in order to connect those regenerative farmers with values aligned funders. And those funders can be across a really broad spectrum of the investment sector. For the most part, our experience is working with the philanthropic sector, and that's because while it's a much smaller and more precious pool of money, generally it comes with a whole lot of less ties, and it gives us the ability to be a whole lot more flexible in a sector that is so clearly misunderstood and that doesn't have control areas. you know, you've only got to have a couple of years of El Nino and then oscillate immediately into La Nina or reverse, and it actually removes your ability to meet some of those expectations and deadlines that are set by the investment sector. What we discovered in this research were a lot of things. We discovered that the ideology that is needed by the regen movement is very hard to meet in the investment sphere, and it is at the baseline of all of it. We have a paradigm of deep regeneration operating with our farmers, and that needs to sit along a paradigm that is ultimately extractive. And that really is the paradigm that our investment sector sits in, even those that operate in the philanthropic world, because we've been built around endless growth. We've been built around benchmarks. We've been built around measurement looking like data sheets. And we haven't been built around what you could argue is a First Nations principle of deep relationship and deep trust. And when there is deep relationship and deep trust of the ecosystem that you're working in, the culture and community that surrounds you, and the paths to market that will support you, it actually replaces the need for measurement. But that actually isn't in existence yet. There isn't that bridge in place. And so what we've found is that we're talking different languages and we have different expectations for outcomes. And so that makes it very, very difficult to seek finance from those who actually understand the work that we're doing, because the work that we're doing is fundamental to life. In essence, you know, that is actually what it means to be regenerative. It means to consider every decision that we make and the long-term impact of whether or not it gives us sustainability, which isn't enough, or deep regeneration of our ecologies. And it's those ecologies that have got the ability to change weather patterns, to change, you know, soil depth, to change diversity of seed banks, to change biology. You know, it has the ability to be incredibly impactful. This particular project that Carolyn is talking about was one of our seeded projects that we funded 12 months ago. Was it just on 12 months ago? That was seeded because we had a deep understanding of how ORCA Co-op works. We trust them implicitly. And we know that they've got the capability to look at the entire ecosystem at a national scale, but also to understand and unpick and tenaciously, relentlessly continue to push for the micro details that will give us or show us the difference between a project that can ultimately have the outcomes that we're looking for and a project that just ultimately makes noise. And we didn't want projects that would make noise. We needed to understand how we actually engage and enable those who are on the ground doing the work that can change our system. Because while they're in the dirt, it seems fairly innocuous, but actually what they're doing is fully looking at a system and working out where the levers are and pushing those buttons. And it's that really needs to be supported. Is that sort of where you wanted me to head with that, Carolyn?
Yeah, thank you, Jane. Thank you. I've just put a link in there for everyone to have a look at the RIF. It is an incredible document, and you know, we feel very honoured to be included and so supported by Sustainable Table. I just one of the things I wanted to touch on quickly is just when I talk about inefficiency of the supply chain. I think Penny actually asked me there about the different grain processing facilities. Obviously, what we've identified from the project is where there's ebbs and flows across the organics production system and how we can plug those gaps. So we're not looking for one big processing facility. We're looking for actually bespoke individual processing facilities in different regions that address the different production requirements of each of those areas. And that's actually why the technology becomes so important. So it's almost like we've always looked at technology separate to infrastructure, but they're actually intrinsically linked in this, kind of like the investment ecosystem in a way, because you've got your philanthropic and your impact investment sort of pools. And this really needs, you know, a different way of doing business, both in the grain space as well as in the finance space.
Fantastic. Well, look, yeah, that was incredibly informative and really, really insightful, especially even from your perspective, Jade, connecting these businesses and looking at government funding as well. I think it's really, really interesting, but also very important to look at it from that perspective, because it all has to work together, but everybody's got different perspectives and everybody's coming at it from different angles. Everybody wants different outcomes. So how you pull that all together is very, very challenging. And Carolyn and Jade, unless you wanted to add anything else, we've already had a question in here, and there's a couple of other questions as well that I know wanted to be asked, which I'll be covering in this Q&A session. Nothing else? All good. Fantastic. Well, Penny, thank you very much for kicking off with the first question in here, asking if there is secondary grain process. Is secondary grain processing being considered at this stage?
If I may comment on that, thank you very much.
Yeah, go ahead.
I agree wholeheartedly with Carolyn saying we don't need scalability, we need replicability, and having many even cooperatively owned secondary processing. And I'm going to take it up with one of our major grain handlers here. He's a privately owned grain handler, not one of the ones. But looking at, because we've got in Canowindra and central west of New South Wales, and there's a lot of grain grown around here, and country is being destroyed in the way it's being done. But to have something else and starting at a small scale is really possible. So I'm going to take that up with a colleague and just start having a yarn about it and just see what he thinks.
Yeah, and I think you raise a really good point, Penny, and, you know, given your farming background, I know you'll understand this implicitly. You know, what we've really identified is one of the reasons that organic grain or grain producers generally are struggling to transition is actually the market for the regenerative crops, and the market being the processing capacity. So if you know, we've got organic grain growers in WA, and they're being demanded by the processors to just grow oats. And so they're literally growing oats every year, year in, year out on the same piece of ground. And as you know, that's actually really destructive, even if it's grown organically. And so everybody wants to talk about regenerative agriculture, but no one understands that actually that means that the producers are literally going to plow in a crop and not be able to derive any income from it to actually be able to regenerate that soil. So part of the processing and the bespoke that we're talking about is tailored to these alternative markets. So, you know, lupins and peas and some of these really rich, protein-rich, regenerative, legume, nitrogen-fixing crops actually don't have markets. And that's essentially what we're trying to do. And your comment about, are we building a second facility? What we want to do is actually build a facility that's on wheels, you know, fundamentally, that can actually be moved. So rather than moving thousands of tons of grain, why on earth are we not moving the dehuller or the colour sorter to actually different regions so that those producers can capture those markets without, like, spelt is a really good example where you're losing 30 to 40% of your product through the dehulling process. So if you were able to dehull that on farm, you actually could keep that as a compost product rather than just as a waste product.
There must be another market, another use for spelt hulls, apart from compost, which is wonderful, but as a commercial product.
Yeah, and no, fantastic. Thank you very much. And clearly it's a topic that we can go into in lots more detail, and perhaps even now is the time to do so, in the sense that we knew regenerative farming was going to come up as a topic in quite a lot of capacity. But is there anything else that you wanted to touch on when it comes to the ORCA investment opportunity in regards to what you really do see as the future? I think your vision, Carolyn, is clearly something that is so insightful from your understanding of the industry and where it can go and what it can do. And especially when you've gone out there and tried to raise capital, there is such a huge disconnect from a lot of the individuals in the space in their understanding of regenerative farming. I'd love us to be able to touch on that as a subject while we're talking about regenerative farming practices for smaller operators versus bigger operators at this point in time.
One of the things that we've sort of developed is is looking at the whole farming system as a whole, and as a consequence, creating markets for soil building crops as well as the cash flow building crops, and one feeds the other consequently. So you become more sustainable or resilient when in the marketplace, because you've got alternative markets, but two, in an agronomic or an ecological sense, in that you have a capacity to continue to grow and actually build the net capital of the land that you're engaging with, and that's an important part of it. And the other process that probably hasn't been really discussed greatly, but the fact that we use the offal from certain parts of the processing facility to feed another part of the market. And so you might have offal from a grain processing facility, and you then can feed that into the feed market and support the dairy sector or the poultry sector, and that adds value to the farmer, because he's not shipping material to a processor and then losing 30% of it as offal, because that offal then can be on-sold to the feed industry and add value. So he's getting a greater return on his sweat equity.
Thanks, Greg.
Right. Anything to add, Carolyn?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think Greg sort of sums it up, and I think it is a very fragmented situation, and that's really what we're trying to do, is map out. And I say it's like herding wild cats, in the sense of trying to build out a fragmented grain sector with the demand side, and then trying to actually build efficiencies into it. And that's why I think is really key, is we need to stop trying to decentralize into these really big processing facilities and actually create these localized, resilient and quite nimble, entities. We've got a couple of producers who've already got existing processing facilities on their properties. What they need is better investment for segregated storage and more efficient packing facilities to actually just build out their existing facilities. And so before we go out and build a whole lot of more of them, my ambition is to help the existing ones to become more efficient and more profitable.
Fantastic. Yeah, redefining value, really important, and busting out the conventional definitions. Penny, really insightful here. When it does come to it, then, Carolyn, you're I think you're alluding to it, but how can ORCA support producers to transition? Is there enough room for more organic producers in the market?
It's a really good question, Robin, and I think it's a really important question for the organic industry, because I think as I came in the organic industry 10 years ago, a lot of producers were afraid of their neighbour becoming organic and being in competition with them. And our view and our continued conversation with our producers is, let's grow the pie and everybody gets a better piece of pie. And I just think that, we've got an untapped domestic market and we have an incredibly untapped Asian market. Like currently, we're literally not exporting any organic grains into the Asian market. And this is because of the lack of processing capacity. But there's a huge market for us to be able to tap into. And the other part is, there's different versions, or there's different levels of biological farming systems. And I think we're really keen to transition towards biological farming systems. Even if people aren't certified organic, even if they're running biological systems, they're actually growing a healthier product and actually treating the land with more respect in that way. So I think that there's a whole lot of steps. And we really see building those business services into the ORCA project is critical, because one of the key aspects is the extension services, unfortunately, have been very funded by the chemical companies and the fertilizer companies. And so what we actually need is our own version, or our own capacity to be able to transition producers to better, without necessarily wanting to sell them another product that's just an organic alternative. And I think that that's a really delicate balance. And I wish the government would step up and do it. I really do. But I guess after 10 years of watching this space, I just think the producers are much stronger to be in charge of their own destiny and be able to build other value parameters around things like the offal, things like the ecosystem markets. And I think there's other ways that producers can build more value and actually then have more control of their own destiny.
Yeah, fantastic.
There's also a growing need for research and development, and obviously you touched on extension, and one of the requirements for research these days is that you have industry development. Previously, I worked as a K-Joint fellow with Southern Cross University's Centre for Organic Research in trying to connect growers with researchers to help with participatory research programs, so that the focus of the research is on the need of the grower, and the researchers are used to facilitate the academic rigor to ensure that the data is actually accepted, not just as a purely anecdotal, but as valued material. And that's happening, and you only have to see what's happening in Europe and the US from the perspective of universities and bodies like FIBL and stuff like that.
And I think it's critical that we realise that the governments have to move. You know, they don't actually have a choice. And I think what we're trying to do is build in the data behind the producers, so the producers actually capture the value, not just the end sellers. You know, and I think the producers are at the coalface of climatic risk, of climatic extremes. The lack of funding is very, very aware at the farm gate. And so I think we need to get more capacity in behind that farm gate and actually increase the profitability and resilience of producers. And that's through better technology and through better efficiencies to actually have better on-farm outcomes. Otherwise, we're going to lose these producers. And I think we're seeing that across agriculture generally, is that the profitability of farms is just getting less and less because the pressure is getting more. And through more efficient supply chains, you're actually pushing back on that metric.
You also allow them to build relationship directly, and therefore trust can be built, and supply chains are shortened, and profit margins are increased, and biological practices are highlighted as a priority more so. So that enables a much stronger, more resilient baseline.
And Penny, thank you very much for asking your question in there. Really great to see your questions, and would welcome anybody else to ask some questions in the chat as well. There's another piece on there as a piece that we wanted to touch on as a subject, because it came up prior to this webinar, was really where the funding is going right now. Agtech as a sector is sort of gaining a lot of attraction in terms of investment, but we know that there are issues with this in the sort of the connection with agtech and agricultural businesses themselves. Do you want to talk about that in a little bit more detail for really all of us to understand?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually love to refer that question to Matthew and get his take on it from a, you know, potential, you know, obviously someone that's really supported, you know, agtech in that space. But I mean, I think we need to make sure agtech is actually what producers need and what the supply chain needs. You know, I think it's one thing to design the most fanciest blockchain XYZ, but if it doesn't actually bring value and help with the on-farm outcomes or the supply chain outcomes, then I think we're in the wrong room. You know, we certainly
ecological
see
outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that we've really seen that through this project is, you know, we've tested the producers with different types of technology. And I think, you know, we need to basically make sure that the data is farmer owned and make sure farmers are in control of their own capacity and then be able to build more value along the supply chain. But I think agtech has a massive place here. Better technology has a huge component to this. But I also think we need to make sure that it's you know, ground-led, not tech-led, if that makes sense.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And do you think that the Helen Haynes recent policy inclusion from Murray Watt extension for farmers to become more biologically and carbon aware could include what we're talking about here?
Well, I think Greg and I could share a little bit of sad stories about our conversations with the federal government to this point. I mean, I think my personal view is the government will follow the leaders. So that, you know, if we lead, the government will follow. And unfortunately, the government's not supporting the domestic regulation for the organic sector at this stage. We hope they will in the future, but they're not at this stage. I think any move towards, you know, transitioning is great. I'm actually very lucky to be in Helen Haynes' electorate. She's one of my champions. I actually have her number in my phone, which is very exciting, and Jade also. But I still think that they have to look after the big commodity markets because that's their bread and butter. And so, you know, and as Penny actually said earlier, they don't like us very much. You know, they don't like single origin grains. They don't like producers being in control of their own destiny. They like the commodity markets are what makes their life more simple. So yeah, I think we need to keep seeing the value of decentralized production systems and be able to build more resilience into those.
I think the greatest hope is the fact that the rest of the world's becoming wiser than what our politicians are, and in the fact that they're actually creating policies to transition to a more ecological approach to agricultural engagement, primarily from a biodiversity perspective, but also from a ecological perspective as well, from an environmental externality perspective, and you just have to look at what's happening with the third default process in the EU, where they're wanting to transfer 25% of their agriculture to organics by 2030. So, and the US have invested, $300 or $400 million in extension processes into organics. They don't do that just for the sake of doing it. They can see the writing on the wall.
And Robin, I'd love to just refer to Matthew, if you don't mind, Matthew. I'd love to hear your view on ag tech and where you see it from an agricultural innovation perspective.
Hey everyone. I mean, the comments that you made, I think, can stand. I agree with them all. Perhaps the only thing I would add is the technology has to yield a sort of an outcome that the market favours. And so whilst it is true that I think everybody on the call here regards it as important that farmers stay in control, that's not a favourable economic outcome in and of itself. So the use of an initiative or the importance of an initiative like this, regardless of whether it involves technology, eventually has to be an advantage of some sort. And so the ability, yes, to have much more kind of nuanced characteristics to a niche product that fits a precise need in the market. These have to be the outcomes that we've got to focus on, right? It's understandable and important that the reservations around data governance and privacy and these sorts of things, but very, very soon now, everything will be observable from increasingly sophisticated satellites. And so it won't be enough to just sort of say we want to stay in control of this, because people will make decisions on your behalf if you don't participate. So I think the end result is these technologies have to encourage more participation and more transparency in favor of identifying niches, identifying opportunities. As a dedicated investor in the space, we very much believe in the reversal of the centralization trend. We very much believe, and we very much invest along the lines of kind of modular, decentralized infrastructure. We think that's fundamental to these sort of trends, and not for nothing, it's pretty fundamental to resilient regional economics as well. So, many of the investments that we've made into GoTerra, into Jupiter Ionics, are along the lines of these trends, and those will, energy, electrification, like so many of these trends are in favor of initiatives like this. But I think it's vital, cooperative operation like this. Yeah, that's probably enough. I would say the trends, the technologies that are important are the ones that will deliver, that will open an economic gap on behalf of the collective owners of the infrastructure. We've sort of seen the dial twist all the way up the other end, and it resulted in an efficient calorie producing engine, but with a lot of negative externalities. And so pushing the dial back the other end, I think there's a lot for collective ownership, not just farmer-led, but regionally driven, to benefit from. And I think a lot of it will be innovation, not just software, not just digital, although they would be important, but democratization of infrastructure, I guess, is a phrase that we would use to describe this kind of initiative. And technology is fundamental there. It just lowers and lowers and lowers and lowers the cost of being able to operate something that you used to have to be massive to own and operate.
Greg, I can
Thanks,
see you
Matthew.
just raised your hand. Oh, Greg has had to go. That's why.
Oh, he's in a bad area, so he may have just dropped off. So no, that's fine. Thank you, Matthew. That's fantastic. I think it's a great summation, actually, of capturing the value of technology and not for just for technology's sake. So we can have more conversations about that.
I kind of hear everything you're saying, and I think it really rings true to an awful lot of industries right now in where they're going, what the shift is to democratization of the opportunity that technological advancements come from in that sense, and hear the issues that have arisen as a result of technological innovation benefiting sort of the larger corporations, but the collective ownership of these smaller organizations is significantly more beneficial for the wider economy. So yeah, I completely hear what you're saying. Without getting political on this, and then we'll sort of leave it there, I think, from a perspective of this ORCA investment opportunity. One thing which I really wanted to do, Carolyn, actually while we're really on this point, is to go into a little bit more detail on phase 1 and then also phase 2, but then also to perhaps just paint a little bit of a picture of what the business looks like when it's fully breaking even, it's self-sustaining, and it's running in and of itself. I think it would be really great to, without providing actual figures, just paint that picture of exactly what the business looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ORCA business itself is basically, enabling the increasing amount of grain transactions. And obviously that's across all different grain types and all different grain regions. And so obviously, as per our documentation, the infrastructure is at a cost recovery level, and the technology enables that two-way marketplace. And so producers in their crop planning are planning in a more profitable mechanism. And then obviously we're building better markets for those products and better and more profitable outcomes. One of the key things about the organic grain sector is there's no transparency around pricing. It's not related to anything. It's not a percentage of commodity. It's not even comparable to international organic grain prices. So it's literally like throwing darts. And our ambition is to basically change that. And so as an ORCA member, you can sell into that market and sell into as a cooperative brand and be able to build out that supply. And so obviously, as I said at the beginning, we're starting on the grain sector. We've already had approaches around the meat sector. We believe about 60% of organic meat is actually going into the conventional market, and we believe we can build that out as well. And obviously the technology side of it improves the traceability in key areas and actually increases that those different components as technology develops. Like, we know that the traceability side of things is still in early stages in some areas. So things like traceability of grain, the DNA testing of grain, those sorts of things is just still very new. But obviously we can build that in over time. And your buyers, as in your key buyers, are wanting that sort of data and that sort of transparency. And there's also the risk of contamination, and that's where that risk is identified through the technology, and your buyers are actually willing to pay for better data to be able to be assured of that end product.
Fantastic. Well, I'd like to invite any final questions that we have from everybody here. I know we've had a lot to cover. I think it's been great and very, very insightful to understand a lot more about the industry. Perhaps I'll throw over to Jade or Carolyn to maybe touch on some subjects that we haven't really covered in this Q&A that you wanted to, I guess, perhaps close on, as this webinar has really covered so much. And we've talked about regenerative farming, we've talked about the industry, we've talked about raising capital in this market. But I'll throw over to either one of you to perhaps touch on a subject that maybe we haven't spoken too much about, that you think would be beneficial.
Jade, do you want to comment on something and then I'll close out?
Let me think about what would be we're talking about. I think what we haven't talked about is the big picture of why we put into regen at all. And I think you've sort of talked about why it's I'm a bit distracted because I know I've got to be on a train in 4 minutes and I'm not yet at the station. So I'm kind of going, so I'll hand that to you because I don't think I can add anything on the hop.
Just right.
Yeah.
Don't miss that train, Jane. No. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining us. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's the segue of the capital and the need. And I think we have touched on it, but I think it's a much bigger conversation. And I also think the transition, like everybody wants producers to become regenerative, but not everybody understands how complex that is, how long that takes, and how much capital is required to provide that and to build the markets to be able to capture those end products. So I think we can't expect the Groundhog Day or to the people on the land to be able to be doing all the heavy lifting when business needs to actually help with that along the journey as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a big challenge ahead of us in the regenerative farming practices that need to be implemented. But yeah, it's the more I learn about this, the more complex it seems. But I know that you can probably talk all day about this and all day about how it can be implemented, and then you come up against these blockers of government alliance, of raising capital. But ultimately, there is a huge amount of power within the hands of the producers themselves if they come together and try to tackle this problem together, which is essentially what you're providing as a platform here. And that's why it's so I think important for this point in time that we really do try and focus on what we need to focus on when it comes to regenerative farming practices, but need to try and work on it all together and try and tackle those problems. Yeah.
And I think just my closing part, Robin, is that we don't want a huge chunk of capital to be lumped into the system. Like, I think it needs to literally grow organically. And that's why I think our share option to be able to add phase 1 and phase 2 and up to phase 10 to basically as we identify and build out those business ecosystems. And we've basically done all the hard lifting to design that mechanism now. And obviously phase 1 is quite conservative. I think we're more than 50% over phase 1, which is fantastic. And we basically just see that we'll just keep building those over time as we identify areas where we can add value.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, look, I think that's a great place to leave it. I want to thank everybody for coming along today and for the conversation, really, which has been so insightful. Just a few closing points here. Our expression of interest, which is on the website, actually closes this Friday. So if you haven't already expressed interest to invest and signed up, you can do so via the website. We will send over the pitch deck after this session for everybody to review. If there's anything else that you wanted to have a conversation on, please do reach out personally. Carolyn, thank you very much for adding the link in there. That's great. Look, just again, thank you everybody very much for today. We've recorded the session and we'll happily send it around to everybody if you wanted to catch any particular subject or topic that we've spoken about in your own time. So without saying anything else, thank you very much for everybody in attending today, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Robin, so much for hosting.
Not a problem at all. It was a pleasure. All right. There we go. I think now you can stop the recording and then send it over afterwards, and I can trim from the start and the end.